Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window on that fateful Tuesday afternoon, watching the rain streak down the glass in chaotic patterns. She held a steaming mug of chamomile tea, a small ritual she'd developed to find moments of peace in her otherwise hectic life as a single mother. Outside, the November weather had turned gray and uninviting, matching the melancholy she'd been feeling lately. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and her 3-year-old son was finally napping after a morning filled with his endless energy and questions about everything under the sun. Sarah was 34 years old, and life had not followed the trajectory she'd once imagined. She'd been married to David's father, but their relationship had crumbled under the weight of his infidelity and substance abuse issues. The divorce had been painful but necessary, and it had left her as the sole provider and caregiver for. She worked as a freelance graphic designer from her apartment, which allowed her flexibility to care for her son while maintaining some financial independence. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and she took pride in providing a stable home for. Their apartment was small but meticulously organized. She'd paint its bedroom a soft sky blue with white clouds to make it feel magical and comforting. His toys were neatly arranged in colorful bins, and his little bookshelf overflowed with picture books that Sarah read to him every single night before bed. She'd created a safe, nurturing environment for her son, filled with love and routine. She attended all of his pediatric appointments, enrolled him in a quality program 3 days a week, and spent her free moments playing with him, reading to him, and showering him with the affection he deserved. The early years of his life had been challenging in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. When he was born, she'd experienced postpartum anxiety that had gone undiagnosed for months. She'd felt constantly terrified that something terrible would happen to him, checking on him obsessively throughout the night. His infancy had been marked by severe colic, hours of inconsolable crying that would leave Sarah emotionally drained and questioning her abilities as a mother. She'd visited her pediatrician, Dr. James, numerous times during those dark months. He'd assured her that colic was a common condition, not a reflection of her parenting, and that it would eventually pass. His calm, reassuring voice had been her anchor during those desperate times. When turned 2 years old, the colic subsided, but he developed severe separation anxiety. He would scream and cry whenever Sarah left the room, even for brief moments. Going to the bathroom with the door closed would trigger meltdowns. She tried graduated exposure therapy, consulting with a child psychologist who specialized in anxiety disorders. The psychologist had explained that this was a normal developmental phase, though its intensity suggested he might have an anxious temperament. Sarah had worked patiently and carefully with creating transition rituals and using positive reinforcement to help him feel secure. She'd never once lost her patience with him, never raised her voice in anger, never treated his anxiety as an inconvenience or burden. Her relationship with her neighbor had been cordial at first, lived 3 doors down in their modest apartment complex. Sarah would nod politely when they passed in the hallway, and once she'd even brought some homemade cookies as a neighborly gesture, but had never returned the warmth. She was a retired librarian in her 70s who seemed perpetually irritated by the sounds of normal apartment living. She'd complained to the building management about Sarah's vacuum cleaner running at 9 in the morning. She'd left passive-aggressive notes about packages being delivered during afternoon hours. Sarah had tried to be understanding, assuming was just a lonely woman struggling with the noise and disruptions that came with living in close proximity to a young child. What Sarah didn't know was that had become obsessed with her, would listen at the shared wall between their apartments, recording her observations in a small notebook. She'd misinterpreted normal childhood anxieties and developmental behaviors as evidence of abuse and neglect. She'd convinced herself that she was protecting a vulnerable child, that she had a moral obligation to report her suspicions to authorities. Had no training in child development, no medical background, no context for understanding normal child behavior. She only had her assumptions, her prejudices, and her mission to expose what she believed was a crime happening behind closed doors. As Sarah stood at her kitchen window that afternoon, sipping her tea, she had no idea that had already picked up her phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. She had no idea that she was about to become the subject of a criminal investigation. She had no idea that her life was about to shatter into a million pieces. The knock on the door came at 3:47 p.m. It wasn't a gentle knock. It was loud, authoritative, and terrifying. Sarah jumped, nearly spilling her tea. Her heart immediately began racing. She set the mug down and walked to the door, her mind scrambling through possibilities. Had there been an accident? Was someone in danger? She opened the door to find two police officers in their dark blue uniforms standing in the hallway. Behind them stood a woman in professional business attire carrying a thick folder. "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" the taller officer asked, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I am," Sarah replied, her voice suddenly uncertain. "Is everything okay?" "We received a report of a child in distress at this address," the officer continued, his tone official and detached. "We need to conduct a welfare check." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What? There's no child in distress. My son is sleeping, he's perfectly fine. Who reported this?" The officers didn't answer. They simply exchanged a glance, and the taller one said, "We'll need to come inside and assess the situation." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. Sarah felt completely as the officers moved past her into her apartment without waiting for an explicit invitation. The woman in professional attire introduced herself as Ms. Foster from Child Protective Services. Suddenly, Sarah's small, safe apartment no longer felt like her sanctuary. It felt invaded, hostile. She watched in disbelief as the officers began moving through her home, their eyes scanning every corner, looking into closets, examining the kitchen for signs of neglect. "My son is napping in his bedroom," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's healthy, he's happy. I don't understand what's happening here." Ms. Foster opened her folder and pulled out a pen. "We received a report that a child in this apartment has been crying excessively, showing signs of emotional distress. We're here to investigate." Sarah's legs felt weak. "Has separation anxiety. He's being treated by a child psychologist. It's a normal developmental." "We'll need to speak with him," the officer interrupted. As Sarah watched the officers move towards bedroom, she felt her entire world beginning to fracture. She'd done everything right. She'd loved her son fiercely, provided for him completely, and sought professional help when he needed it. Yet here she stood, being treated like a criminal in her own home, while her sleeping child was about to be interrogated by strangers. The nightmare had begun. Woke confused and frightened by the presence of three strangers standing in his bedroom doorway. His small face was flushed from sleep, his hair disheveled, his stuffed elephant clutched tightly against his chest. He looked up at his mother with frightened eyes, searching for reassurance that everything was okay. Sarah's heart shattered at the sight of his fear. She wanted to run to him, to scoop him into her arms and shield him from this nightmare, but the officers held up their hands, indicating she should stay back. "We need to speak with alone," Ms. Foster announced, her tone brooking no argument. "Absolutely not," Sarah said firmly, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. "He's 3 years old. He doesn't understand what's happening. If you want to speak with him, I'm staying right here." The officers exchanged glances. The taller one, whose name tag read officer, seemed to consider this. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Fine, but you don't speak. You don't prompt him. You simply observe." Sarah moved to his bed and sat on the edge, placing a reassuring hand on his small back. She could feel him trembling. Ms. Foster pulled up a small chair and positioned it directly in front of. She had the demeanor of someone who'd done this 100 times before, clinical, detached, professional. But her professionalism masked a troubling lack of sensitivity to the terrified 3-year-old before her. "My name is Ms. Foster," she said in an exaggerated, patronizing voice that made Sarah wince internally. "I'm here to talk to you about your home. Do you like living here?" Didn't respond. He buried his face against his mother's leg. "Can you hear me?" Miss Foster pressed. "Does your mommy ever make you cry?" Sarah felt her jaw clench. The question was leading, suggestive, and completely inappropriate for a 3-year-old. But she remained silent, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from objecting. "Does your mommy ever hurt you?" Ms. Foster continued, her pen poised over her clipboard, ready to document any response, or more accurately, ready to interpret any response to fit her predetermined narrative. Shook his head slowly, but he didn't look up at Ms. Foster. He was clinging to his mother like a life raft in a storm. Ms. Foster made a note on her clipboard. Sarah watched her write, her stomach churning with dread. Whatever she was writing would become official documentation, would become part of a file that could destroy Sarah's life. The officers continued to observe the scene with stone-faced expressions, their presence adding to the oppressive atmosphere. What happened next would haunt Sarah for months to come. One of the officers, the shorter one with a name tag reading officer, produced a German Shepherd police dog from the hallway. The dog's name was Rex, and he'd been specially trained to detect signs of abuse and trauma in children. The theory was that children who'd experienced abuse often displayed fear or aggression toward authority figures, and a trained dog could pick up on subtle behavioral cues that might indicate maltreatment. His face, which had been buried against his mother, suddenly looked up. His fear seemed to momentarily transform into curiosity. The dog was large and intimidating, but there was something about Rex that didn't trigger alarm in the young child. Perhaps it was the animal's calm demeanor, or perhaps it was simply that had an innate connection to animals that transcended the tension in the room. "Does react to dogs?" Ms. Foster asked, making more notes. "He likes animals," Sarah replied carefully, choosing her words. "He's never been around police dogs, but he's never shown fear of dogs in general. He visits his friend Tommy's house, and Tommy has a golden retriever. They play together." Ms. Foster made another note. Whatever Sarah said seemed to be filtered through the lens of her preconceived narrative. A normal child who liked animals and played with dogs didn't fit Ms. Foster's image of an abused child, but somehow, she seemed determined to find evidence that contradicted reality. The officers observed interactions with Rex carefully. The boy didn't cower or show fear. He didn't display aggression or behavioral red flags. He simply looked at the dog with the neutral curiosity of a young child encountering something new. To anyone trained in child psychology, his behavior indicated a secure, emotionally stable child. But Ms. Foster seemed frustrated by this observation. After nearly an hour of this intrusive investigation, the officers finally indicated they were ready to leave. But before departing, Officer turned to Sarah with a grave expression. "We're going to recommend that Child Protective Services conduct a full investigation," he said officially. "Depending on the findings, there may be legal consequences." Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her. "But there's nothing wrong here. My son is healthy and happy. I would never hurt him." "We're not accusing you of anything at this point," Ms. Foster said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "We're simply following protocol based on the report we received." After they left, Sarah locked the door behind them and scooped into her arms. He was confused and tired, still processing the strange encounter. She carried him to the couch and held him tightly, her mind racing with terrifying possibilities. What would happen next? Would they come back? Would they take away from her? Over the following weeks, Sarah learned that had filed the report. She also learned that Ms. Foster had conducted a follow-up home visit, during which she'd observed his behavior, and concluded that his withdrawn and emotionally distant demeanor suggested trauma and abuse. Sarah tried to explain that was naturally shy with strangers, that his separation anxiety often manifested as withdrawal when confronted with unfamiliar adults. But Ms. Foster had already made up her mind. The turning point came when Sarah received an official letter from the Department of Child Protective Services. It stated that an investigation had been opened into allegations of child neglect. Pending the outcome of that investigation, Sarah's custody would be temporarily restricted to supervised visitations only. A caseworker named was assigned to the case, and she would be conducting regular home visits. Sarah read the letter 3 times, unable to comprehend the words. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not to someone who loved her child more than life itself. Not to someone who'd sacrificed everything to provide a safe, nurturing home. She called her sister Jennifer immediately, her voice breaking as she explained the situation. Jennifer, who lived 2 states away and hadn't spoken to Sarah in over a year due to some family drama, suddenly became her lifeline. "You need a lawyer," Jennifer said firmly. "This is serious, Sarah. You need to fight this." That night, Sarah sat in her apartment after was asleep, her hands shaking as she scrolled through lawyer websites and read reviews. She found herself on the website of James, a defense attorney with an impressive track record of defending wrongfully accused parents. His bio indicated that he specialized in cases involving false allegations and flawed investigations. His reviews were glowing. Parents he'd represented praised his dedication, his strategic brilliance, and his compassionate approach. Sarah's fingers hovered over the "Contact Us" button for a long moment. Then she clicked it and began typing an email that would change the course of her life. "Dear Mr.," she wrote, her heart pounding in her chest, "I am writing to you because I believe I am the victim of a false accusation." Sarah's hands trembled as she held the official court document. The letterhead from the Department of Child Protective Services seemed to mock her with its cold, bureaucratic formality. The words jumped off the page in a blur of legal jargon and accusations that felt surreal and nightmarish. She read the same paragraph 5 times, unable to comprehend that this was really happening to her, that society's systems designed to protect children could be so catastrophically wrong. The document outlined the preliminary findings of the investigation. It stated that based on the report filed by a concerned neighbor and the observations made during the initial welfare check and follow-up visit, there was reasonable cause to believe that the child may be experiencing emotional neglect and abuse. The language was vague, almost intentionally ambiguous, yet it carried the weight of legal authority. It didn't say Sarah had harmed. It said there was reasonable cause to believe. That phrase would become her nightmare. What infuriated Sarah most was the absence of any concrete evidence. There were no photographs of injuries. There were no medical reports indicating abuse. There were no witnesses to wrongdoing. The entire case was built on the subjective interpretation of a child's normal developmental anxiety by Ms. Foster, a woman who'd spent less than 2 hours with Total. The court order contained another bombshell that made Sarah's blood run cold. It stated that pending the full investigation and any subsequent court proceedings, Sarah's unsupervised custody would be immediately suspended. All visitation would have to occur under the supervision of a court-appointed monitor. Sarah would not be allowed to be alone with her own son until the investigation was concluded and a judge determined it was safe. Sarah read that section again, certain she'd misunderstood. But no, the words were painfully clear. She would not be able to put to bed at night. She would not be able to comfort him if he had a nightmare. She would not be able to give him a bath or help him use the bathroom. Every moment with her son would be monitored, scrutinized, judged by a stranger who would be looking for evidence of her guilt. She called her sister Jennifer again, her voice raw with desperation. Jennifer, who worked as a paralegal at a law firm, gave her the direct advice she needed to hear. "You need James immediately," Jennifer said firmly. "This is escalating. They're going to keep pushing this unless you have legal representation fighting back. Call him today. Don't wait." Sarah found James' number and dialed it with shaking fingers. A receptionist answered and informed her that Mr. was with a client, but could potentially fit her in for an emergency consultation the next morning if she could be available at 8 a.m. Sarah agreed without hesitation and hung up the phone, feeling a fragile spark of hope for the first time since the nightmare began. That night she didn't sleep. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every interaction with, searching for anything that could be misinterpreted as neglect. Had she been too impatient when he was crying? Had she not responded quickly enough to his needs? Had she somehow failed him without realizing it? The guilt, though unfounded, was suffocating. The next morning, Sarah sat in James' office, and within 10 minutes, her new attorney had thoroughly reviewed her case and reached a conclusion that was both reassuring and terrifying. "This is nonsense," he said bluntly, setting the file down on his desk. "There's no case here. They have nothing. A neighbor's complaint about normal childhood crying and one social worker's subjective observations don't constitute evidence of abuse." "Then why is this happening?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "Why do they have the authority to separate me from my son based on nothing?" "Because the system is flawed," James replied with the weariness of someone who'd seen this injustice many times before. Child Protective Services has broad powers to investigate allegations. They're designed to err on the side of caution because the stakes are so high, the safety of children. But that same broad authority can be weaponized by vengeful people with grudges. James explained that they needed to immediately file paperwork challenging the supervised visitation order. They would request an expedited hearing before a judge. He would argue that separating Sarah from without concrete evidence violated her due process rights and caused unnecessary harm to the child. Meanwhile, he would begin investigating Sarah's background to determine if she had a history of making false accusations. "How much will this cost?" Sarah asked, her voice small. She'd already spent money on the initial consultation and was terrified of the financial burden ahead. "We'll work something out," James said, showing a rare moment of compassion. "I take on some pro cases when I believe in them. This is one of those cases." Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah's life became a nightmare of logistics and emotional torture. She had to schedule visitations with through the court-appointed supervisor, a tired woman named Barbara who seemed to view the entire situation with bureaucratic indifference. Each visit was exactly 2 hours, always in a supervised visitation center that felt clinical and sterile. Would cry when Sarah had to leave, and Sarah would drive away with tears streaming down her face, feeling like her heart was being torn from her chest. The supervised visitation center was a converted warehouse with colorful murals on the walls trying unsuccessfully to create a cheerful atmosphere. There was a play area with toys, a small kitchen where Sarah could prepare snacks for, and several tables where they could sit and eat together. But the atmosphere was always tense. Barbara would sit nearby, pretending to read a magazine but actually watching Sarah's every move with the intensity of someone investigating potential criminal behavior. Sarah had to account for everything. Why was she holding his hand? Why was she hugging him? Why was she asking about his day at the... Every normal parental interaction felt like it was being documented as potential evidence against her. She began to second-guess her own parenting, wondering if her natural affection for her son could be twisted into something sinister by the people investigating her. Meanwhile, remained blissfully anonymous to Sarah. She didn't know that her neighbor had become obsessed with her family. She didn't know that maintained a detailed notebook documenting every sound that came from her apartment. She didn't know that had convinced herself that she was a hero, protecting an innocent child from a negligent mother. One day, Sarah received devastating news. The caseworker had recommended that the Department of Child Protective Services pursue formal charges against Sarah for child emotional neglect. The recommendation stated that Sarah's failure to adequately soothe separation anxiety indicated a pattern of emotional neglect. Proposed that be placed in temporary foster care while the investigation continued. Sarah felt like the ground had opened up beneath her. Foster care, separation from her son, the injustice was so overwhelming that she could barely function. She called James' office and left a desperate message. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't think about anything except losing permanently. James called her back within an hour. "We're filing an emergency motion to block the foster care placement," he said with calm determination. "And we're moving up the hearing date. This needs to go before a judge immediately. They're overreaching, and I'm going to make sure the court knows it." As Sarah hung up the phone, she clung to the hope that James had instilled in her. She had to believe that justice would prevail, that the truth would come out, that she and Anne would be reunited. The alternative was too devastating to contemplate. James' office was located on the 14th floor of a prestigious downtown building, yet it felt nothing like the sterile, corporate law offices Sarah had imagined. Instead, the space was warm and inviting, with lining every wall comfortable furniture and photographs of families displayed prominently on James's mahogany desk. As Sarah sat across from him for their first full consultation, she found herself studying his face, trying to determine if this man could truly be the miracle she desperately needed. James was 63 years old, with silver hair, kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades fighting for the underdog. He wore his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, giving him an approachable, no-nonsense demeanor. When he spoke, it was with the calm confidence of someone who'd won more battles than he'd lost. "I've reviewed your case file," James began, sliding a thick folder across his desk toward Sarah. "And I want to be absolutely clear about something. This is one of the most flimsy cases I've encountered in my 30 years of practice. We're going to dismantle it completely." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed to hear those words until James spoke them. "How is this even possible?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How can they do this to me without any evidence?" James leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. "Because," he said slowly, "the system is designed with a fundamental asymmetry. Child Protective Services operates from the principle that it's better to overreport than underreport. The logic is sound in theory. Protecting children is paramount. But in practice, this philosophy creates an environment where someone can destroy a family's life based on nothing more than suspicion and a vindictive neighbor's complaint." He stood and walked to his window, gesturing for Sarah to join him. From the 14th floor, they could see the entire city spread out below them. "See all those people down there?" James asked. "Many of them go through their entire lives without ever being falsely accused of a crime. But parents are uniquely vulnerable to accusations like this because society grants enormous discretion to the state when it comes to child welfare. It's a power that's frequently abused." James turned back to face Sarah. "But here's what's important. We have the truth on our side, and the truth, when properly presented, is powerful." Over the next hour, James outlined his strategy. First, he would file a motion demanding discovery, all the evidence the prosecution had against Sarah. "This will force them to reveal their entire case," he explained. "And when they do, we'll see that they have nothing." Second, he would immediately begin investigating background. "People don't file false reports in a vacuum," James said. "There's usually a pattern, a history of complaints, a motive, a psychological profile that suggests a vendetta." Third, he would work with expert witnesses, child psychologists, developmental specialists, and pediatricians, who could testify about the normalcy of behavior and the inappropriateness of Ms. Foster's conclusions. "What about the court order?" Sarah asked. "The supervised visitations. Will I be able to spend time with unsupervised again?" "We've already filed an emergency motion to block the foster care placement and restore your unsupervised visitation rights," James said. "Judge is reviewing it. She's tough, but she's fair. When she sees the lack of evidence supporting this case, she'll be furious that the system has been misused in this way." Sarah felt a fragile hope beginning to take root in her chest. "What happens now?" "Now," James said, gesturing for her to sit back down, "we prepare for trial. We have approximately 4 weeks before the hearing. During that time, I need you to do several things. First, document everything, every interaction you have with during supervised visits, every piece of evidence that demonstrates your love and care for him. Write down dates, times, what you discussed, how he appeared emotionally. He handed her a thick legal pad. Second, gather character witnesses. People who can testify to your parenting abilities, your character, your relationship with, your pediatrician, your employer, friends, family members, anyone who can speak to who you are as a person and as a mother. What about, Sarah asked nervously, will he have to testify? Ideally, no, James replied. A 3-year-old testifying would be catastrophic for him emotionally and for us strategically. Child testimony in abuse cases is notoriously unreliable, but we may not have a choice. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. James pulled out a file labeled and opened it with a determined expression. Meanwhile, my investigator is looking into your neighbor's background. I suspect we'll find some interesting patterns. What kind of patterns? Sarah asked. People who file false reports typically have a history of complaints, James explained. They call the police frequently. They make noise complaints. They involve themselves in their neighbor's business. They often have a savior complex. They see themselves as protecting the community from hidden threats. Sometimes there's an element of mental illness. Sometimes it's pure vindictiveness. Over the following week, James's investigator, a woman named Maria, discovered that had filed 17 complaints with local police over the past 5 years. She'd reported neighbors for excessive noise, suspicious activity, potential drug use, and child abuse concerns. Of those 17 reports, exactly 0 had resulted in charges. All of them had been deemed unfounded after investigation. "This is gold," James said when he called Sarah with the news. "This establishes a clear pattern of false accusations. It shows that has a vendetta against her neighbors, that she uses the system as a tool for harassment." When Sarah's pediatrician, Dr. James, agreed to testify on her behalf, he provided detailed medical records documenting health and normal development. "Has never shown any signs of abuse or neglect," Doctor told James during his deposition. "He's a healthy, normally developing 3-year-old. His mother has been attentive to his medical needs, keeps all his appointments, and is appropriately concerned about his developmental progress." Sarah's employer, a graphics design firm owner named Robert Harrison, agreed to testify that Sarah was a dedicated employee and responsible adult. "I've worked with Sarah for 3 years," Robert said. "She's one of my most reliable employees. She takes her responsibilities seriously, both at work and as a mother." As the trial date approached, Sarah felt a strange mixture of hope and terror. James had assembled a compelling defense, but she knew that trials were unpredictable. She knew that juries could be swayed by emotional arguments, that the appearance of wrongdoing could sometimes feel more powerful than the absence of evidence. She also knew that the state had enormous resources and the backing of institutional authority. One evening, 2 weeks before the trial, James invited Sarah to his office for a late-night strategy session. They sat across from each other, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, medical records, and investigative reports. "I want you to understand something," James said, his expression serious. "This trial will be emotional and difficult. The prosecution will try to paint you as a negligent mother. They'll question your parenting choices. They'll make you doubt yourself. But we're going to show that courtroom what the truth looks like. We're going to demonstrate that you're not just innocent. You're an exemplary mother who's been wrongly accused by a vindictive neighbor and failed by a flawed system." "What are our chances?" Sarah asked quietly. James was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and looked Sarah directly in the eyes. "Between you and me, I think we're going to win, but I've learned never to make promises in these situations. All I can tell you is that I've done this many times before and I know how to fight. We're going to fight for you and with everything we have." Sarah left his office that night feeling more hopeful than she had in weeks. James might be her only hope, but he seemed like exactly the kind of person who could navigate this nightmare and bring her and back together. The courtroom of Judge was exactly what Sarah had imagined during her worst nightmares. It was austere and imposing, with high ceilings and mahogany paneling that gave it the appearance of a place where profound justice was dispensed. But to Sarah, sitting at the defense table in a modest blue dress that James had advised her to wear, the courtroom felt more like a coliseum where she was being thrown to the lions. The gallery behind her was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and a handful of supporters who'd shown up to witness what was becoming a high-profile case in their community. Judge entered the courtroom with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She was in her late 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her reputation, James had explained, was that of a jurist who valued evidence over emotion, facts over speculation. Sarah hoped desperately that this reputation would work in her favor. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Michael, a man in his mid-40s with slick-back hair and an aggressive courtroom demeanor. Had built his career on high-profile family law cases, and he approached this case with the theatrical flair of someone who believed himself to be protecting society from hidden predators. He wore an expensive suit and an expression of righteous conviction that made Sarah's stomach churn. "Your Honor," began his opening statement, "this case is about a mother who failed to provide basic emotional care to her 3-year-old son. The evidence will show that Sarah Mitchell ignored her child's cries for help, that she failed to respond appropriately to his emotional distress, and that this pattern of neglect has caused significant harm to the child." Sarah wanted to stand up and scream that everything he was saying was a lie. James placed a steadying hand on her arm, silencing her without words. "The defendant wants you to believe that her son's severe anxiety and constant crying are normal childhood behaviors," continued, packing in front of the jury with the confidence of a prosecutor who believed he had an open and shut case. "But the evidence will demonstrate that this child's emotional distress far exceeds what any reasonable parent should tolerate without seeking comprehensive mental health intervention." James stood for his opening statement, his approach markedly different from his theatrical style. He was calm, measured, and direct. "The evidence will show," he said quietly, "that Sarah Mitchell is an exemplary mother. It will show that her 3-year-old son is a normally developing child with age-appropriate anxiety. It will show that this case is built on a neighbor's vindictive complaints and a social worker's deeply flawed assessment. Most importantly, it will show that there is absolutely no credible evidence of abuse or neglect." The prosecution's first witness was the neighbor who'd initiated this nightmare, took the stand with the solemnity of someone who believed herself to be a heroic. She was dressed in her finest clothing, a pale blue dress that suggested she'd dressed up for her appearance in court. Her thin lips were pursed, and her eyes had the fervent gleam of someone convinced of her own righteousness. "I heard crying," began, her voice quavering with manufactured emotion. "Night after night, I would hear this child screaming and crying for hours. It was the most heartbreaking sound I've ever heard. I knew something terrible was happening in that apartment." Under's gentle questioning painted a portrait of Sarah as a negligent, cold, and uncaring mother. She claimed to have heard crying so intensely and for such extended periods that she feared for his life. She never heard Sarah comforting him, never heard soothing voices or attempts to calm him down. James's cross-examination was brutal in its precision. "Ms.," he began, "how many noise complaints have you filed with local police in the past 5 years?" His face tightened. I don't recall exactly." "Let me refresh your memory," James said, holding up documents. 17 complaints, 17. And of those 17 complaints, how many resulted in charges being filed?" "I don't know," muttered. 0, James said loudly, ensuring the jury heard him clearly. 0 out of 17. Is it possible, Ms., that you have a pattern of making accusations that don't hold up under scrutiny? His face flushed with anger, but she didn't answer. The second witness was Ms. Foster, the social worker who'd conducted the initial investigation. She took the stand with the bearing of an expert and treated her testimony with deferential respect. Ms. Foster about her observations during her visits to Sarah's apartment. She described as withdrawn and emotionally distant, as showing signs consistent with emotional abuse. In my professional opinion, Ms. Foster concluded, the child is displaying behavioral markers consistent with a home environment where emotional needs are not being adequately met. James approached his cross-examination of Ms. Foster with controlled fury, barely concealed beneath a veneer of professionalism. Ms. Foster, he began, how many hours did you spend with during your investigation? Approximately 3 hours total, Ms. Foster replied. 3 hours, James repeated. And based on 3 hours of observation, you formed the opinion that this child is being emotionally abused. My training and experience allow me to make assessments based on limited observation, Ms. Foster said defensively. Let me ask you this, James continued. Are you a pediatrician? No. Are you a child psychologist? No, I'm a social worker. Did you order any psychological testing of this child? No, I didn't feel it was necessary. Did you consult with any medical professionals before making your assessment? No, I relied on my professional judgment. Your professional judgment, James repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism, formed over 3 hours without any medical consultation, without any psychological testing, without any concrete evidence of abuse. Is that correct? Ms. Foster's face flushed. I based my assessment on observable behaviors that are consistent with. With what? James interrupted. With normal 3-year-old anxiety, with age-appropriate separation anxiety that affects millions of children and is completely normal. The gallery erupted with murmurs. Judge banged her gavel once, demanding order. Then came the prosecution's expert witness, Dr., a child psychologist who'd been hired by the prosecution to support their narrative. Doctor, that children who experience emotional neglect often display anxiety symptoms similar to what was reportedly displaying. He spoke in clinical language that made normal childhood behavior sound pathological. But when James cross-examined Doctor, he brought along the weapon he'd been saving. Actual medical and psychological records from his pediatrician and the child psychologist who'd been treating his separation anxiety. Doctor, James said, holding up the records, are you aware that this child has been under the care of a licensed child psychologist for the past 8 months? Doctor shifted uncomfortably. I was not provided with those records. You were not provided with the medical records? James asked incredulously. Despite claiming to be an expert on this child's psychological state, nobody provided you with his actual medical history. Those records were not made available to me, Doctor said defensively. And yet you with certainty about this child's emotional state and the cause of his anxiety, James said. Doctor, isn't it true that children with separation anxiety, the actual diagnosis this child has received, often improve significantly with appropriate professional treatment? Yes, that's true, Doctor admitted. And isn't it also true that this child's mother sought out that treatment? That she took her son to a child psychologist to address his anxiety? I suppose, Doctor said reluctantly. You suppose? James asked sharply. Either it's true or it's not. Did Sarah Mitchell seek professional help for her son's anxiety? Yes, it appears she did. So the prosecution wants this court to believe that Sarah Mitchell is emotionally neglecting her son, yet she's also actively seeking professional mental health treatment for him. Is that your testimony? Doctor didn't answer. The inconsistency was glaring. As the first week of trial ended, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic. The prosecution's case seemed to be crumbling under James's skilled cross-examination, but still had his closing arguments, and the jury would ultimately decide her fate. She tried to sleep that night but couldn't stop her mind from racing with what would come next. The trial was far from over, and the stakes remained devastating. It was Thursday night, 3 days into the trial, when James made his decision. He sat in his office well past midnight, surrounded by legal precedents, case files, and psychological research papers. Sarah sat across from him, exhausted and emotionally drained from the first week of testimony. The prosecution had rested their case that afternoon, and now it was James's turn to present the defense. He had approximately 24 hours to prepare, and he was about to propose something so unconventional that it could either revolutionize the trial or destroy Sarah's case entirely. "I want to try something," James said slowly, removing his glasses and rubbing his tired eyes. "It's risky, it's unconventional, and it could backfire spectacularly. But I think it's our best shot at making the jury truly understand that is not an abused child." Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "The police dog," James said. "Rex, the German shepherd that was present during the initial investigation." "I don't understand," Sarah said, confused. "What does the dog have to do with anything?" James stood and began packing, his mind clearly working through the implications of his idea. Rex was trained to detect signs of abuse and trauma in children. The training is based on the theory that children who experienced abuse often display behavioral cues that a trained animal can pick up on: fear responses, aggression, anxiety around authority figures, withdrawal. He turned back to face Sarah. "When Rex was in your apartment during that initial investigation, he didn't display any behavioral responses indicating that was in danger. He didn't alert on. He didn't show any of the behavioral markers that a trained dog would show if it detected abuse." "I remember," Sarah said, just looked at him curiously. "Exactly," James said, his eyes bright with the intensity of an idea taking shape. "What if we bring Rex back into the courtroom during the trial? What if we have interact with the dog in front of the jury? A trained police dog that specializes in detecting abuse would be the most objective witness we could possibly present." Sarah's eyes widened. "You mean put on the witness stand?" "Not exactly," James explained. "I would request that Rex be brought into the courtroom. The jury would observe's natural reaction to the dog. If shows genuine affection, trust, and comfort with Rex, it would demonstrate to the jury that this is a child who is not traumatized, not abused, not emotionally neglected. A child who is secure and emotionally healthy." "But won't the prosecution object?" Sarah asked nervously. "Of course they'll object," James said. "Strenuously. They'll call it a circus act. They'll argue that a dog isn't a credible witness. They'll say it's prejudicial and inappropriate. But here's the thing. Judge has shown throughout this trial that she values creative legal arguments and unconventional thinking. She's intelligent. She understands that sometimes you need to step outside traditional evidentiary frameworks to arrive at truth." James sat back down across from Sarah. "The prosecution has presented their case, and it's weak, but it's also emotionally compelling. They've painted a picture of a suffering child and a negligent mother. To counter that narrative, we need something powerful, something that transcends clinical testimony and speaks directly to the jury's intuition about whether this child is truly suffering." "What if it doesn't work?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "Then we've lost," James said bluntly. "But I think we lose anyway if we stick to traditional defense strategy. This case won't be won with character witnesses and medical records. It will be one when the jury sees, with their own eyes, that is a happy, secure, emotionally healthy child." The next morning, James filed an unusual motion with the court. He requested that Rex, the police dog from the Department of Animal Control K-9 unit, be brought into the courtroom as part of the defense presentation. He argued that the dog's behavioral response to the alleged victim would constitute relevant evidence regarding the child's emotional state, and Ada objected immediately and vehemently. "Your Honor," he said, his face flushed with anger, "this is exactly the kind of circus tactic that undermines the credibility of this court. A dog is not a witness. A dog cannot testify. This is prejudicial, it's inappropriate, and it has no basis in law or science." Judge listened to both arguments carefully, her expression unreadable. She'd been on the bench for 25 years and had developed an intuition for when lawyers were grasping at straws versus when they were employing genuine legal innovation. James had impressed her throughout the trial with his meticulous preparation and his cutting cross-examinations. He wasn't the type to propose something frivolous. "Mr. Judge said, walk me through your legal reasoning here." James stood with the confidence of someone who'd prepared extensively for this moment. "Your Honor, the prosecution has built their case on the premise that this child is displaying behavioral markers consistent with emotional abuse and neglect. The primary testimony supporting this conclusion comes from Ms. Foster's observations and doctors' expert opinions. However, both of those witnesses based their assessments on subjective interpretations of normal childhood behavior." He paused, letting the judge absorb his words. "What I'm proposing is to present an objective assessment. Rex is trained specifically to detect signs of abuse and trauma in children. His behavioral response to the child would be based on instinct and training, not subjective interpretation. If Rex displays comfort and trust around this child, it would constitute objective evidence that the child is not being abused." "Mr. Judge asked, giving the prosecution an opportunity to respond. "This is speculative pseudoscience," argued. "There's no established legal framework for using a dog's behavior as evidence. The jury will be confused and prejudiced by this stunt." Judge considered both arguments for a long moment. Then she made a decision that shocked both lawyers and everyone in the courtroom. "I'm going to allow it," she said. "However, I want to make clear that I'm not admitting the dog's behavior as evidence of abuse or lack thereof. Rather, I'm allowing the jury to observe the child's interaction with the dog, which is observable behavior that the jury is entitled to witness. The interpretation of that behavior will be for the jury to determine." She looked directly at James. "But Mr., I'm warning you, if this backfires, if the jury perceives this as a stunt or if it prejudices them against your client, you'll have accomplished the opposite of what you intended. Are you prepared for that risk?" "I am, Your Honor," James said firmly. As the courtroom emptied for lunch, Sarah felt a mix of terror and hope. This was it, the moment that would determine her fate. Either this gambit would vindicate her and reunite her with her son, or it would destroy the careful defense James had built and seal her fate as a convicted child abuser. That afternoon, James met with Sarah in the courthouse conference room to prepare her for what would happen. "Doesn't need to testify," James explained. "The jury will simply observe his behavior with Rex. We want him to be natural, to be himself. Don't coach him. Don't tell him what to do or how to act. Just let him be a normal 3-year-old meeting a dog." Sarah nodded, though anxiety churned in her stomach. She'd been restricted to supervised visitations for weeks now. She'd barely gotten to spend time with, and now she was about to put her son on display in front of a courtroom full of strangers to determine his mother's fate. "Trust me," James said, seeing her distress. "This is going to work, I can feel it." That evening, Sarah called the visitation center and requested an emergency supervised visit with. She needed to see him before tomorrow, needed to hold him and reassure herself that he was okay. Barbara, the supervisor, must have sensed the desperation in her voice, because she agreed to extend the visit to 3 hours instead of the standard 2. When saw his mother, he ran to her with the unfiltered joy that only a 3-year-old could display. As Sarah held him, she whispered prayers that whatever happened tomorrow would bring them back together permanently. She had no idea that the next day would change everything. Friday morning arrived with the weight of destiny. Sarah woke at 4 a.m. and couldn't fall back asleep. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through every possible outcome. By 6 a.m., she'd given up trying to rest. She showered, dressed carefully in the same blue dress she'd worn throughout the trial, and sat waiting for James to pick her up. Every second felt stretched and elongated, as if time itself had slowed down in anticipation of what was about to happen. When they arrived at the courthouse, the hallway outside Judge's courtroom was already packed with reporters and curious onlookers. Word had spread through the legal community about the unconventional strategy James was employing. Some legal experts had already dismissed it as theatrical desperation. Others were intrigued by the creative approach. The media attention added another layer of pressure to an already unbearable situation. James guided Sarah through the throng of reporters, refusing to answer questions. His expression was focused and determined, but Sarah could sense the tension radiating from him. This was his gambit. If it failed, the criticism would be merciless. Inside the courtroom, Judge took her seat promptly at 9 a.m. The jury filed in, looking curious about what the day's proceedings would bring. After the emotional of the prosecution's case and James's systematic dismantling of their witnesses, the jury seemed engaged and genuinely invested in the outcome. "Before we proceed," Judge announced, "I want to address the presence of an animal in this courtroom. The jury will observe the interaction between the child and the police dog. You are permitted to note the child's behavioral responses. However, you must understand that the dog's presence is not being admitted as expert testimony. The dog cannot speak. The dog cannot testify. What you will observe is simply a child's natural behavior when encountering a trained animal. The interpretation of that behavior is entirely within your purview as jurors." Ada stood. "Your Honor, I want to lodge my formal objection for the record. This is prejudicial and has no basis in established evidentiary law." "Your objection is noted," Judge said coolly. "Proceed, Mr." James stood and gestured toward the courtroom doors. "Your Honor, I would like to call Mitchell to the courtroom." The courtroom doors opened, and a court officer brought in. The 3-year-old looked confused and frightened by the sea of strange faces. He was dressed in a small navy blazer and khaki pants. James had specifically instructed Sarah to dress him in formal but age-appropriate clothing. Eyes searched the courtroom frantically until they found his mother. His face lit up with recognition. James said gently, "I want you to sit here in this chair while I show you something." Climbed into the chair that had been positioned in the center of the courtroom, visible to every juror. He clutched his small stuffed elephant, a security object that James had permitted him to bring into court. Sarah watched from her seat at the defense table, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst through her ribs. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone understood that something significant was about to happen. Then the doors opened again. Rex entered the courtroom on a leash, guided by his handler, Officer James Park from the Department of Animal Control K-9 unit. The German Shepherd was massive, easily 80 pounds of muscle and fur. His presence was immediately commanding and intimidating to most adults in the courtroom. Several jurors visibly tensed. This was a police dog, a trained weapon in the hands of law enforcement, now standing in the center of a family court proceeding. For a moment, nothing happened. Stared at the dog with cautious curiosity. Rex walked closer, his leash slack, his handler allowing the dog to approach the child at his own pace. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Then something extraordinary occurred. His face transformed. His fear vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unfiltered joy that was impossible to manufacture or fake. His eyes widened with genuine recognition and delight. He stood up slightly in his chair, his small hands reaching out involuntarily. "Good dog," said, his voice clear and innocent and filled with unguarded affection. Those 2 words hung in the air like thunder. The courtroom erupted. Not with chaos, but with something far more powerful, an emotional response that transcended the legal frameworks and clinical testimony that had dominated the trial. Jurors gasped audibly. One woman's hand flew to her mouth in shock. Another juror openly wept. The gallery behind Sarah burst into murmurs and exclamations. Ada stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "Objection! Objection! This is—" "Sit down, mister," Judge said sharply, her own expression showing that she understood the significance of what had just transpired. James remained silent, letting the moment speak for itself. He didn't need to say anything. The jury had just witnessed something that no amount of expert testimony could refute. A child expressing genuine affection and trust toward a stranger and a trained animal. Not the fearful, withdrawn, traumatized child that the prosecution had described. Not a child showing signs of emotional abuse and neglect. But a secure, emotionally healthy child whose natural response to a new experience was joy and openness. Continued reaching toward Rex, and Officer Park guided the dog closer. The child reached out and touched the dog's fur, his small face radiant with wonder. "Soft," said, examining the texture of Rex's coat with the fascination of a toddler discovering something magical. For the next 2 minutes, and Rex interacted while the entire courtroom watched. The child showed no fear. He displayed no behavioral markers of trauma. He simply enjoyed the experience of petting a dog with the uncomplicated happiness of a normal, healthy 3-year-old. When Officer Park began leading Rex from the courtroom, called out, "Bye, good dog, come back." The innocence of those words, the natural affection in his voice, the emotional security displayed in that simple goodbye, it had accomplished what James had gambled everything on. It had shown the jury, beyond any shadow of doubt, that this was a child who was loved, secure, and emotionally healthy. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her son being led from the courtroom. James reached over and squeezed her hand. His expression remained professionally neutral, but she could sense the satisfaction radiating from him. The gamble had worked. As the courtroom fell silent again, Judge looked directly at the jury. "We will now hear the defense's closing arguments," she announced. But everyone in that courtroom already knew the verdict. The jury had witnessed it with their own eyes. They'd heard it in his voice. They'd seen it in his face. The question of whether Sarah Mitchell had neglected and abused her child had been answered definitively, not by expert testimony or medical records, but by a 3-year-old's genuine expression of joy and security. Ada's case had crumbled. The prosecution's narrative of a suffering child and a negligent mother had been shattered by 2 simple words spoken with innocent affection. "Good dog." As James stood to present the defense's closing arguments, he made eye contact with each juror. He didn't need to say much. The evidence had been presented. The truth had been revealed. The jury had seen it themselves. "Mitchell is not an abused child," James began simply. "He's a healthy, happy 3-year-old boy who loves his mother and who shows no signs whatsoever of emotional neglect or trauma. Everything you've witnessed today confirms that truth. Everything." The jury deliberated for exactly 47 minutes. 47 minutes for 12 citizens to overturn a narrative that had dominated Sarah's life for 3 months. 47 minutes to acknowledge that they'd been presented with false accusations, flawed investigations, and the malicious complaints of a vindictive neighbor. 47 minutes to render justice. Sarah sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with James, her leg bouncing nervously. She couldn't eat. She couldn't breathe normally. Every second felt like an eternity. James sat beside her with the calm demeanor of someone who'd been through this process countless times before. He checked his email, made a phone call about another case, and generally appeared unaffected by the tension. But Sarah could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his fingers moved slightly faster than normal as he scrolled through his phone. "They're coming back," James said suddenly, his phone buzzing with a message from the courtroom officer. "It's time." Sarah's legs felt weak as she stood. James offered his arm, and she held onto it like a drowning person clinging to a life raft. They walked back into the courtroom together. The gallery had filled up again. Reporters, curious onlookers, and Sarah's few supporters all waiting to witness the verdict that would determine her fate. Judge took her seat. The jury filed back in. Sarah studied their faces desperately, trying to read their expressions, but they maintained the neutral demeanor that jurors were instructed to adopt. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge asked. The jury foreman, an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "On the count of child emotional neglect, how do you find?" The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Sarah's heart pounded so violently she thought she might pass out. "Not guilty," the foreman said clearly. The courtroom erupted. Sarah collapsed into her chair, her body racked with sobs of relief and release. Months of tension, fear, and desperation came pouring out of her in waves. James placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his expression showing the first crack in his professional composure. He smiled, a genuine, triumphant smile that revealed his absolute conviction that justice had been served. Judge banged her gavel once, commanding order. When the courtroom settled, she looked directly at Sarah with an expression of controlled fury. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge said, "this court finds you not guilty of all charges. Your full custody of your son is immediately restored. Moreover, I want to address the record here because what has transpired in this courtroom is deeply troubling." The judge removed her glasses and looked over the courtroom with an expression of judicial authority. An innocent woman was subjected to a criminal investigation, had her custody of her son temporarily suspended, and was forced to defend herself against charges that were utterly baseless from the beginning. This case represents a catastrophic failure of our Child Protective Services system. Judge turned her gaze toward the back of the courtroom, where Ms. Foster sat. "Ms. Foster, your investigation in this case was reckless, biased, and fundamentally unprofessional. I am recommending that your licensing board conduct a full investigation into your conduct." She then turned to look at, and to the person who filed this complaint, "You have abused the legal system designed to protect vulnerable children. You have weaponized law enforcement against an innocent person out of spite and vindictiveness. This court is considering filing charges against you for filing a false report." The severity of Judge's statement sent ripples through the courtroom. This wasn't just a verdict. This was a public indictment of everyone who had participated in destroying Sarah's life based on false accusations. After the courtroom was dismissed, Sarah was reunited with. The social worker who'd been monitoring his care brought him to her in the courthouse hallway. When saw his mother, he ran to her and threw his small arms around her neck. Sarah lifted him, holding him tightly, and wept with the profound relief of someone who'd been granted a second chance at life. "Mommy?" asked, his small voice confused by her tears. "I'm okay, baby," Sarah whispered, holding him close. "I'm okay now. We're going to be together just like before, forever." 6 months later. Sarah stood in her living room, looking out the window at the city below. Was napping in his bedroom, his separation anxiety having gradually diminished over the past 6 months with continued professional support. Life had slowly returned to something resembling normal. The legal battle hadn't ended with the not guilty verdict. In fact, it had intensified in different directions. Had been charged with filing a false report, and she'd accepted a plea deal involving community service and mandatory counseling. The investigation revealed that her obsession with Sarah had escalated over the years, and she'd been diagnosed with a delusional disorder by her own mental health provider. She posed no further threat now that she was under mental health supervision. Ms. Foster had been brought before her licensing board and found to have engaged in grossly unprofessional conduct. Her license had been suspended pending a full review. An internal investigation of the Department of Child Protective Services had revealed systemic failures in training and oversight that had allowed biased investigators to make determinations that destroyed families. Sarah had filed a civil lawsuit against both and the Department of Child Protective Services for malicious prosecution and violation of her civil rights. The case had settled for a significant amount, $75,000, which Sarah had carefully placed into a trust fund for education. She also established a foundation to advocate for parents' rights and to help families falsely accused of child abuse navigate the legal system. James had become something of a celebrity in legal circles. Law schools across the country began studying the case as an example of creative legal advocacy. He'd been interviewed on several legal podcasts and had written an op-ed in the American Bar Association Journal about the systemic failures that had allowed this case to proceed. Judge had also used her platform to advocate for reform. She'd written a comprehensive essay for the state's judicial review arguing that Child Protective Services needed stricter evidentiary standards before removing children from parents' care. Her essay had sparked a statewide debate about balancing child protection with parental rights. But for Sarah, the most profound changes weren't the legal victories or the financial settlement. They were personal. She'd started a support group for parents falsely accused of child abuse. Every Thursday evening, she met with other families who'd been through similar nightmares. She listened to their stories, offered advice based on her own experience, and helped them navigate the legal system. The group had grown from 5 members to 42 in just 6 months. She'd also become an advocate for stronger accountability measures within Child Protective Services. She before the state legislature about her experience and recommended reforms to their procedures. Her testimony was moving and powerful, and it had helped inspire several bills aimed at improving investigative standards and protecting parents' rights. Had thrived. His separation anxiety, while still present, had diminished significantly. He'd started preschool and was making friends. He attended art class and music lessons. He was a normal, happy child whose life had nearly been destroyed by false accusations and systemic failure. One evening, as Sarah was tucking into bed, he looked up at her with his innocent eyes and asked, "Mommy, why did that lady say mean things about us?" Sarah had prepared for this question. She sat on the edge of his bed and took his small hand. "Some people get confused," she explained gently. "Sometimes people believe things that aren't true, but that's okay because good people helped us, and now we're together and nothing can separate us again." "I love you, Mommy," said, already half asleep. "I love you too, baby," Sarah whispered, kissing his forehead. "So much." As she left his room and closed the door quietly, Sarah reflected on the journey from that terrifying day when the police knocked on her door to this moment of peace and security. The nightmare had been real, the trauma had been deep, and the injustice had been profound. But she'd survived it. She and had survived it together. The legal battle had become a catalyst for change. The case that had nearly destroyed her life had become an instrument of justice for others. Sarah used her platform, her story, and her determination to fight for a system that would be more careful about destroying innocent families in the name of child protection. She thought about James, about his faith in her when she had none, about his willingness to take an unconventional risk that had changed everything. She thought about Judge's fierce commitment to justice. She thought about all the good people who'd believed in her and stood with her. But most of all she thought about those 2 simple words he'd spoken to a police dog in a courtroom. "Good dog." Words that had held the power to overturn false accusations, to restore justice, and to set her free. Sarah realized that life would never be quite the same. The trauma of false accusation, of having her motherhood questioned, of being separated from her son, that would stay with her. But she would transform that pain into purpose. She would use her experience to help others, and she would never take for granted the gift of having her son in her life. As she poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: peace. The nightmare was over, the vindication was complete, and their future together was finally, mercifully beginning.